Forum. And we're going to go to Brett Colburn, Grand Road, and followed by my colleague, Susanna. And then we're going to wrap it up. So, Ellie, a few quick minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Governor. I'll come right off the bench, keep it to 5 minutes or less. Yeah, I just want to show the title, please. The title page.
But the next one, in PowerPoint.
Is this one?
No,
Should be, no.
PowerPoint. PowerPoint.
I just have the.
My job at Boston Global Forum is in terms of increasing awareness through art, through the community at large and to the world at large, on the problems that Boston Global Forum chooses to look for solutions for. The first one is this one we're dealing with now, the South China Sea. When you see this video, it's going to be 3 minutes. I want you to keep in mind the quote that we have caveman minds and at the same time science fiction weapons. And when we look at these videos,
Living on the reefs where the water level covered half their bodies, the Vietnamese sailors set up commanding positions along the edge of the reefs to lay the defending lines and tried to prevent the enemy from advancing forward. They were threatened by the Chinese to retreat from the reefs. This intrusion caused strong reaction from the Vietnamese defenders to hold their flag. They determined to hold on to the reef and keep their flag flying at any cost. Just because the Vietnamese Navy had refused to withdraw from the reef, the Chinese used battleship for firing with 37mm anti-aircraft guns directly at the unarmed and light-armed Vietnamese sailors on the reefs, who were not able to attack them for their defending positions. They also fired fiercely with 100mm gun at the 3 Vietnamese transport ships. 2 of them sank.
High above the South China Sea, the radio crackles with a stern warning. The source of dispute appears on the horizon seemingly out of nowhere. Islands, man-made by China, hundreds of miles from its coastline. In just 2 years, China has expanded these islands by 2,000 acres, the equivalent of 1,500 football fields and counting. Engineering marvel, waters as deep as 300 feet. What used to be the Fiery Cross Reef now has early warning radar and airport towers, and a runway long enough to handle every aircraft in the Chinese military. Some are calling it China's unsinkable aircraft carrier. These videos of the islands, taken from the P-8's advanced surveillance cameras, never before declassified.
I apologize, we don't have the PowerPoint, but I'll take 2 minutes to let you know and tell you, in Eastern Europe, I'm working with a Project Exodus, which I co-founded, where we work with children, painting and creating images that have to do with genocide and the causes of genocide and crimes against humanity. I'm taking that same framework to Boston Global Forum. I am going to China and talking with the art community about doing the same thing. The idea is to have young people, not only teenagers, but if we go down to even 8-year-olds, we can increase empathy, we can increase perhaps for the future the prevention of these kinds of things. Again, I apologize not having the images, but thank you very much.
Tom?
So in a previous conference, we issued a white paper, Framework for Peace and Security in the Pacific. It's posted on our website. For this conference, we prepared a follow-up report that focuses entirely on China's actions in the South China Sea. Again, it's on our website, and I'll just briefly say what it contains. It contains a detailed documentation of China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea, explains, as best we could, China's lack of transparency about its intentions, and in detail discusses China's rejection of the use of international law to govern these disputes, and its insistence on bilateral solutions, which would put the smaller nations at a disadvantage in such negotiations. And we conclude the report with a set of possible responses to China's actions. One, finding ways to strengthen international law, particularly the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, fostering economic integration in the region on the assumption that interdependency will reduce the likelihood of armed conflict, developing a code of conduct along the lines that was discussed earlier in this session. And finally, we ask, but really don't answer the question of whether a strategic alliance is needed in the region. It would be an alliance where the member nations would stand together in the face of aggressive action devoted or directed at any one of them, minimally including the US, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Australia, and it would be formed with the standing invitation of membership to China, should it agree to the alliance's norms and standards. Again, that's a quick summary. It's on our website, and I invite you to take a look at our report. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent?
So first of all, thank you to the forum. Thank you, Governor, for having me. And I also want to give my best to the junior Chinese Intel official who's probably listening to us right now. Hope they've enjoyed all of the presentations. I was given a very similar assignment as the professor. In 3 minutes, talk about how we avoid armed conflict in the South China Sea. I'm at the Kennedy School right now as a fellow, but before that I was the head of public affairs at the Pentagon under both Secretary Hagel and the first 6 months of Secretary Carter's tenure. As you all know, the #1 qualification that a public affairs person has is that you get to sit in a lot of meetings with a lot of smart people. So these conclusions are based on those wonderful experiences. I'll keep it very, very short. I think 2 things we have to keep in mind. Bonnie hit on one of these earlier. First of all, you have to remember this is crucial for U.S. economic interest. Those of you that have been to the Straits of Malacca and seen this flow and transit of goods understand that what we're talking about is a strategic situation with economic impacts. And so that's something that matters to people here at home in a way they may not realize, but is very real if we get this wrong. And second, we just need to remember that when it comes to China, we're playing the long game, right? This is the 30, 40-year problem, and that has to influence our thinking. So a lot of what we talked about today is how do we deal with this right now, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how do we deal with China writ large but this is a symptom of the types of problems that we're going to have. 4 quick things, 3 that will resonate as things we've touched on today. 1, I think that's a little bit outside the box. The first thing we need to do is make sure we have clear lines of communication. That's at every single level. Professor talked about a lot of those. Tactically, we need to be making sure we have codes of conduct for the intersection of ships and planes so we don't have accidents and unintended incidents. That's happening. We're working on that. I think we're making some progress. If we stick to them is another thing, but we're starting to put them in place. Second, moving up the tree a little bit, mill-to-mill relations. I think we've made progress under that. It was a real area of focus for both Secretary Panetta and Secretary Hagel. And again, that's very important over the long run because that mill-to-mill, especially the uniform-to-uniform relationships, can become a safety valve and also a conduit for trusted diplomacy when traditional diplomacy is being gummed up by public discourse and some of the rhetoric that political figures in both countries may be using. And then finally, we're going to have this conversation in public at a political level. And I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we do that in a way that shines a light on what China is doing. We saw Jim Sciutto's piece about his P-8 flight that garnered quite a bit of attention. I think the most interesting thing to remember about that is that was a regular P-8 flight that we flew every single day. And the Chinese only got angry once it became public that we were doing that. And we weren't not public about the fact we were doing it, it's just that footage wasn't on TV every day. So that public discourse and transparency from our side, even if they aren't transparent, is important. Number 2, long-term military spending and planning. We have wolves closer to the door right now in terms of the Middle East and what's going on with Putin, but we can't lose sight of the requirements that we have to make sure we are investing in this part of the world. A lot of what the President's talked about with the rebalance. We have to stick to that. That includes making sure that we are addressing not just these examples of a Chinese military that is looking outward more and more. That includes their Blue Water Navy and their investment in aircraft carriers. That includes increased UN participation in peacekeeping by the Chinese. They're showing they're going to push out, and we need to make sure that we have the capabilities in 20, 30, 40 years to deal with that. That means making investments now. And on a side, quick editorial note, during the debate last week, all of the candidates got my least favorite debate question, which is, what is the #1 geopolitical threat to the United States right now? If I did have to give a one-sentence answer, it's sequestration. It's the thing that puts not just this strategy or our attempts to develop the strategy in this area at risk, it puts all of our security at risk. So if we don't do something about sequestration, China and other problems around the world are just going to get harder. And then the third thing that we've talked about consistently is increasing partnerships in the region. So we need to take advantage of the fact that Chinese actions are driving people in our direction. We saw this last spring at the Shangri-La Security Dialogue, which happened right after that CNN report and right after pictures were released showing howitzers on some of these islands. There was a very different tone with a lot of our partners, both traditional and non-traditional partners in the region. So Australia, Japan, South Korea, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The fourth one, and then I'll wrap up, is we need to figure out cyber, because we always assume the ignition point for a conflict with China is going to be in the South China Sea. The ignition point can be in the cyber realm, and then the escalation can be in the South China Sea, a place where we are about to have a lot of ships and planes flying around in very close contact. So we need to look at the entire China problem, especially the Wild West of the China problem, which is the cyberspace, and get our arms around that quickly. So this doesn't become where bad gets worse, not just where bad starts. So, Schwan, was that pretty good? 3 minutes? Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Thank you all.
Okay, Grant. A few minutes, and we're going to do Suzanne. Oh, wait.
Thanks very much, Governor, and Tuan, be able to come. There have been many interesting and useful comments here today. I think Sean's talking about the need for some kind of comprehensive national strategy for China, extremely important. A couple of different ways of looking at that are hard power, soft power, smart power. You know, we have to think about the soft power aspects. On the dime, you talked about the military side. I'm going to bring 2 small suggestions that are on the DI and E side. The first one is that in the last paragraph of Bill Hayden's book, he talks about the need to de-escalate the South China Sea, that Taiwan can play a very important role, because they actually developed the map in 1947 on which the line is based. And I spent a very interesting hour with a Taiwan scholar, an international legal scholar, this summer, looking at that map. And as you look at it, there's a line in the upper left-hand corner, which is the land border of Vietnam and China. And then the same type of line comes into the South China Sea, but it's separated by dashes. His interpretation of that is, this is not a settled boundary. This is subject to negotiation between the parties. This is not the story that we hear from China about this, but it kind of takes the wind out of the sail for China. If in fact this is an informational point, this is an eye out of the dime, that one point that we could pursue. It might be worth inviting some of these Taiwan scholars to talk to us in more detail. The second point that I wanted to bring up is, and I'm sorry the Japanese consul had to leave early because they played a very important part in this, and that is that if you remember, on September 25th and 26th of 2012, after the so-called nationalization of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, that the fleet from Suao Harbor in Taiwan came up and was repulsed from the islands by the Japanese Coast Guard in what looked like a fog of war photos at the time. Very dangerous. There could have been encounters, there could have been collision, there could have been a ship sinking. But somehow President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan and Prime Minister Abe of Japan had a statesmanship moment where they decided that they would break the impasse in negotiations of 16 years of negotiations that had failed to come to a fishing agreement between Taiwan and Japan. And that spring, in April, they actually concluded that fishing agreement. So I went to ask questions about, how did this happen? How is it actually being implemented? Is it a success? Is it not? So it's a very short agreement, a couple of pages, 5 articles, but good description of an area 3 times the size of Taiwan that is now a joint fishing area between the parties. The big areas of discussion between them are in the southern part, where there's a triangle that's almost right over the Okinawa Trench, and on the east side, where there's a quadrilateral. So there are zones in here where there's the most conflict between the fishing boats, between Taiwan and Japan. And so the fishing committee that was set up in Article 3 of the agreement meets at least once a year, and they have managed to sort out the hard problems of whether to fish east-west or north-south. The nets are 40 kilometers long, 25 miles long. They cross. The Taiwan nets are much heavier. The Japanese equipment is destroyed. This big problem. But the committee has been able to work this out. They're working hard. There are 2 small triangular areas that are not settled yet, but they're still on the negotiating table. So I just wanted to bring this up as an example of something out of the diplomacy and economic side that Taiwan is now involved in negotiating a fishing agreement with the Philippines, moving into the South China Sea. And so that this is a model that could go on with Vietnam, Malaysia perhaps. But just a couple of examples as food for thought.
So there is hope for a little constructive dialogue. Professor Ogden, join us.
Thank you. I first wanted to just say something about the comment that the political candidates were paying so much attention to the Middle East and not to China and the South China Sea. I think this is explainable in part because the islands are pieces of rocks and territory that don't involve a large number of people. There haven't been a large number of deaths involved in these conflicts. Whereas in the Middle East, we have a constant military presence by the United States, and a lot of people have died, and there are literally millions of migrants. So I think that's one of the reasons that it doesn't rise to the forefront of American thinking about China. When the average American thinks about China, they're often thinking about trade, trade competition, loss of jobs, or something like that. They're not thinking about the South China Sea. I've been asked to talk about the Boston Global Forum's framework for peace and security that is posted on the website. I think it's an excellent document on its 4 major points. which is respect for international law, mutual respect among affected countries, regional interdependence and multilateralism, plus ideas of economic development, a code of conduct, and more confidence-building measures in the area. But I have some problems with it when it comes to the statement that the United States military presence in Asia needs to be expanded, and of course that's what everybody is talking about today. So I'm the last speaker. I should have been one of the first, and everybody could have railed against me. I want to just conclude by looking at trying to understand China from the perspective of if you're sitting in Beijing rather than in London or New York or Washington, the world looks quite different. East Asia looks quite different. China is about the same size as the United States, but unlike ourselves, it has, I think, close to 20 countries on its borders. And it is also a country that is fully aware of what the United States has done in the world, how it sometimes uses human rights policies to justify intervention, and it's also aware of our policies, our NATO policies of expansion, after promising that we would not continue to expand NATO to Russian borders. We have, in fact, done that and tried to do more of it. Furthermore, the Trans-Pacific Pact feels, if you're in Beijing, a lot like part of a new containment policy for China. And China is also aware that the United States has ignored other kinds of developments in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, but it treats China's actions doing the same thing, comes down hard on them. So in the South China Sea, after 2002, when China honored the Code of Conduct Agreement permitting only joint drilling in disputed waters, ASEAN countries drilled hundreds of wells in disputed waters, and the United States said nothing. But when China did it, we spoke out, as Bill Overholt has pointed out in great detail. China has a foreign policy that has underlying principles, but China is also changing some of its attitudes and is also responding to some of the pushback by the Japanese and the United States and others in East Asia. And so I think if we look at China today, we have to look at a country that is also looking at alternatives. It's not just looking at the South China Sea. It's also very interested in the Silk Road and the One Belt, One Road concept. It's building think tanks that is hoping to promote its own values worldwide. Its press and its television is dedicated to this. For those of you who get the Boston Globe, while Xi Jinping was here, we were treated to the China Daily, tucked into the Boston Globe every day that he was in the country. And we get it every week on a weekly basis anyway. So China's trying to promote its own values. It doesn't have to be necessarily hostile. Let me just conclude by building on what Elizabeth Economy has said about some of the things that we need to do to make possibly more peaceful world in East Asia. First, the United States needs to give China a chance to lead in the world, to forge policies and present them on their own initiative on things like climate change, even Afghanistan and many other things. Get them involved, have them participate with us in these policies. Secondly, don't create a problem when there is none. China's new infrastructure and investment bank could be extremely valuable for all of us. It could be valuable for East Asia. There's no reason to make a big fuss about this. And we should not give the Chinese any fodder for ideas about building further air identification zones by the things that we do. And finally, not everything needs to be framed as a competition between China and the United States. We're part of a very complicated world, and there's a lot more going on than just what's going on between China and the United States. So we need a framework that involves not just China and the United States, and neglects other countries who are very important to all of us in this world and what they do. Thank you.
Leaves us on a somewhat more hopeful note. Llewellyn, a final word from you. 1 minute, and we're going to wrap things up.
1 minute. Mike,